Thank you for coming. As you may know, this is a joint venture event between the UN Initiative and the NYU student government. So before we begin and I introduce our panelists today, I just wanted to speak a bit briefly on what the UN Initiative is. So we've been in operation since 2015. We are an entirely student-led operation, and our mission statement is to connect students with a genuine interest in international politics with those leaders who form those politics. To that extent, we serve as the official liaison with the UN, and we generally host government officials. With that being said, in the preparation for this event, we actually reached out to the ambassador of the permanent mission of Sudan to the UN, along with the DPR of the permanent mission of Sudan to the UN. Ultimately, both of these figures denied our offer to come in today. So I want to make a very clear statement right now. The panelists that we currently have with us are the leaders of the diasporic Sudanese Revolution. So it is our sincere honor to have them today. Thank you, everyone. With that, I will be now introducing all of our panelists. So to my right is Bayan Abu Bakr. She is an NYU senior who will be pursuing a PhD at Yale next year in the Department of History. Next to Bayan is Mr. Ismail Kushkush, journalist specializing in East Africa and Sudan. Next to Mr. Kushkush is Ms. Nisreen Al-Amin, PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University. And last but not least, on the end of the table is Ms. Marine Al-Nil, Sudanese activist, mental health professional, and trauma researcher based in New York City. In addition, just behind us, we're very happy to be hosting two very notable figures within the topic as well. Ms. Susan Steigent, on the left side, Director of the Africa Program at the United States Institute of Peace, calling in from Washington, D.C. And to the right, Mr. Khaled Al-Bahi, political cartoonist, Skyping in, joining us from Copenhagen, Denmark. It is currently 1 a.m. in Copenhagen, so recognition is deserved for Mr. Khaled staying up for us tonight. Thank you very much. And with that, I will now be reverting to our panelists who will be shortly introducing themselves.
Hi all, my name is Bayan. As Omar mentioned, I'm an NYU senior. I major in history. My focus has been race and race making and locating Sudan as a site of ethno-nationalism in the 19th century. And yeah, I'm a member of Student Government Assembly. I'm the Center for Muslim Students, a co-author of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Resolution. And yeah, thank you all for coming. This has been like a long, thank you. So yeah, thank you all for coming. It's so nice to have so many people in this room. So thank you all for caring as much about Sudan as we do. And yeah.
Hello, my name is Ismail Kushkush. I'm a freelance journalist. I was based in Khartoum for about 8 years, reporting mostly for the New York Times, CNN, and VOA, and also reported from Nairobi, covering East Africa, mostly the Horn of Africa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nisreen Al-Amin, and I'm, as was mentioned, a PhD student, about 3 months from graduating, hopefully. And I'll be starting to teach in the African Studies Department at Columbia next fall. And I definitely would not call myself a leader of the Sudanese diaspora in this revolution. I have been following closely, but I think for me, I'm mostly interested in thinking about so before I started my PhD, I was also an organizer, did a lot of social justice work, and I'm really interested in thinking about this moment as someone who has allegiances to both Sudan and the United States, and how we can build a movement that connects to groups like the Black Lives Matter movement and other Black-led anti-imperialist groups, and sort of learn from the history of the anti-apartheid movement. Just thinking about that organizing at a kind of more local rather than at the kind of legislative level.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice. Thank you for showing up. It's very nice to see a crowd of Sudanese and non-Sudanese who are interested in this topic. I'm Marine Al-Nil. I'm a mental health professional and trauma researcher. My research interests are mostly in trauma and the impact of war. In Sudan, previously, I worked with refugees and war-affected people. Currently, I'm more interested in psychotic disorders and their relation to war. And if I could, sorry, if I would also like to add, it's not just that, like what Nasreen said, I don't consider myself a leader of the diaspora revolutionaries, but I also think that the diaspora cannot be leaders of the revolution. We are supporters. We're on the sidelines. The real revolutionaries are on the ground there in Sudan.
Ms. Steigent and Mr. Al-Bey, can you provide us with a short bio as well, please?
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Khalid Al-Bey. I'm a political cartoonist, artist, and culture producer. And yes, as Muzan said as well, we are not leaders of the change. I think the leaders of the change are right now in the sit-in and the ones that gave their lives to this change.
Good evening. My name is Susan Stigant. I'm really honored to join this panel of really distinguished people and to be part of the conversation tonight. I'm the director of the Africa program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. For those of you who don't know USIP, we are a nonpartisan, independent institution that was founded by the U.S. Congress. And our mission is to support individuals and organizations and communities find nonviolent ways to resolve conflict. And I have to say, if we ever need a case study, Sudan, I think, makes all of us incredibly proud and inspired right now. My association with Sudan started before my current role. I lived and worked in Sudan between 2005 and 2011. I was based in Juba, but traveled frequently and spent quite a bit of time in Abyei in the two areas and traveled frequently to Khartoum. I also had the pleasure of working with an initiative called the Sudanese Initiative for Constitution Making that started in 2010. There was a thought that there would be a new constitution, a new constitutional moment, and that group has continued to work really hard. So I'm excited to think about where does that fit in as this transition moves forward.
Thank you to all our panelists for their introductions. We'll now be reverting to Mr. Ismail, who will be providing us with a short presentation on how we got here today.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to start with two short video clips from the protest. This first clip is from December 19th, 2018 in the northern city of Adbara, where all of this began. It started with high school students who were protesting the tripling of the prices of bread. They went to school to have breakfast, and they found that the price of bread had tripled. And this is from a few days before the pushing out of President Bashir, right outside of the army headquarters in Khartoum. Note the chant. This is the chant that became popular in the Arab uprisings of 2011, Shab Yurid Isqat al-Nizam, that people want to bring down the regime. Now, note the following chants.
Bear with us, everyone. Unfortunately, the sound cannot be made any louder, so we just have to listen closely.
So what they're chanting is Tazgud Bas, which is colloquial Sudanese Arabic for just fall or must fall. And this chant, Fog, Fog, Sudan na Fog, which is a soccer chant. Up, up, Sudan, up. What's interesting about this clip is the local aspect of the Sudan protests, with these chants that are Sudanese Arabic, and then the popular chant from the Arab uprisings. So what I'm going to do is quickly go through 200 years of Sudanese history so we can have an understanding of how we got here. Sudan is complicated. It's not an easy country to understand or report from, but I think it's really important to have some understanding of how we got here. So this is a map of Sudan, and these are the cities where we saw many of the big protests. Adbara, as you see right here in the northeast, was a major flashpoint, so to speak. Gadarif in the east, and then other cities, Mulwaba, Al-Ubayd, and then, of course, in the capital, Khartoum. So how did we get here? Sudan was an Anglo-Egyptian colony, became independent in 1956. And since its independence, there have been major issues of debate, major themes within Sudanese modern history that have created an unstable political situation. Debates mostly have been around the issue of identity, how to reach a permanent constitution, how to govern Sudan, and full independence or unity or independence first with Egypt and then with South Sudan. Identity, generally we like to think of Sudan as an Afro-Arab country. What that actually means and how different Sudanese understand that has been a contentious issue. Is the country Arab? Should its policies gear towards the Arab world and the Middle East? Is it African? Is it both? Can we reach something in between? And what does that mean for education policies, cultural policies, and social relations? Arabic is the official language in Sudan, but of course there are many other languages. And this is why this issue is important. Should the state fund educational programs in other languages like Bija, Nubian, for the various languages in the Nuba Mountains, and also with the languages of South Sudan? This is before the separation of South Sudan and becoming an independent state. The issue of social relations, the legacy of slavery in Sudan. What does that mean for social relations, foreign policy, etc.? So this is one of the contributing factors to political instability in Sudan. The other is the debate over a permanent constitution, particularly the role of Islam. Should Islamic law be the law of the country? Should it be one element in a general law? This also has been one of the major issues of debate between different political parties in Sudan. Then how to govern Sudan? Should it be a liberal democracy in the inherited British colonial style? Should it be a socialist country? Should it be an Islamist country? Of course, different political parties advocating for one vision or the other. Should it be parliamentarian, presidential? Should it be a central government, or should it be a federal government? Note, in the 50s and 60s, the word federalism in Africa was a dirty word. It was seen as for politicians at least understood it that way, it was seen as a prelude to secession. So these are issues have been issues of debate. Then, of course, the issue of independence or unity, first with Egypt. Sudan was ruled by two countries. In a way, it was unique in that way. It was ruled by both Britain and Egypt, what was known as the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. Egypt saw that, the Egyptian government through history saw that it had a stake, it had the right to rule the southern Nile Valley. This was, of course, an issue of debate in Sudan. Sudanese went for independence in 1955 on December 19th, which is the very date that these protests started, which was interesting in itself, the proclamation of independence, and it officially became independent on January 1st, 1956. South Sudanese never, Sudan was, as a country, like many African states, created out of empire building. And South Sudanese never saw themselves as a part of this entity called Sudan. And in 2011, after two civil wars from 55 to 72, and then later from 83 to 2005, voted in a referendum in 2011 to become an independent state. So these four major issues: identity, reaching a permanent constitution, how to govern Sudan, independence or unity, have caused unstable governments, have contributed to unstable governments. Sudan, since its independence, in the 60 years since its independence, has fluctuated 6 times between civilian government and military rule. This is the third popular uprising in Sudan. The first being October 1964, then again in April 1985, and then December 2018. Conflict, of course, also has been a feature of the modern Sudanese history. Civil war in southern Sudan, as I mentioned, but also in other regions of the country, the Nuba Mountains, which is now the southern part of what is northern Sudan. I know this is confusing, but this is, and then in the region of Blue Nile, and of course Darfur in 2003. So all of this is the background of modern Sudanese politics. 1989, there was a successful military coup, the third in Sudanese history, that brought President Omar al-Bashir, and it was an alliance between al-Bashir and Hassan al-Turabi, who was the ideologue of the Islamist movement in Sudan. It sought to take Sudan into an Islamist orientation, what it called the Islamic Civilizational Project. And that had implications socially, politically, and economically. It created a great deal of polarization, whether nationally among Sudanese political actors or regionally with surrounding countries that did not want to see an Islamist-led government. Of course, socially also with the introduction of laws, particularly laws pertaining to women, that created the social polarization, and of course economically with new ideas of on economics that were not necessarily successful. It saw the intensification of civil war in the south. The government had a reputation for supporting international Islamist movements of different varieties. That doesn't mean necessarily some were extreme, some were not, but various Islamist movements. There was a division between Turabi and Bashir and split in 1999 that saw a different orientation and really became, since 1999, Bashir's attempt to stay in power. There's greater interest in the affairs of Sudan, especially by international NGOs. Sudan's support for Palestinian movements also kind of brought it into the the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And then, of course, after 2001, the Bush's war on terrorism, Sudan became one of the countries of interest. War broke out in 2003 in Darfur. 2005 saw the end of the civil war in South Sudan, what was known as the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, and which led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. And since then, Sudanese government has been trying to bring itself outside, out from the cold, so to speak, by trying to push for the lifting of U.S. sanctions and delisting itself from the list of countries supporting terrorism. Prelude to this current wave of protests, this uprising, first in 2014, the government had initiated what it called the national dialogue, especially after the protest of 2013 that saw the death of 200 people, or more than 200 people. The results of that dialogue were unsatisfactory. Though the protests actually were, at this point, were slightly dwindling. April 6th, there was a call for a sit-in outside of the Army headquarters. The major group that has been playing a lead role in organizing Sudanese is the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is basically an independent trade union parallel to the government-sanctioned one. To be honest, that the images on April 6th, to me, as a journalist who worked in Sudan, that large of a sit-in outside of Army headquarters were surprising, because that's a street that you couldn't even park your car or stop. To see thousands and thousands of people outside of the Army headquarters and the Army not intervene, it was a game changer. It showed that something had shifted, not only among protesters, but even among Army officers and how they saw where this was going. April 11th, Bashir was pushed out. There was an internal coup by one of his allies, Ibn Auf, who also was pushed out the next day. It was a coup within a coup. And now we have Mr. Abdel Fattah Burhan as the leader of the Transitional Military Council. I know that's a lot of information, but I think my colleagues will also be going into more details, but this just gives you some background to understand what's happening in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Mr. Kushkush for providing a glorious contextualization of Sudanese history, better than I could have done, or anybody else could have done, I'm sure. And this really sets up greatly for the first question, because to this day, protesters are still in al-Qiyada, which is where the sit-in outside of the Army headquarters are. And so I'd just like to start the discussion with the question of why are protesters still sitting in at the military, given that we've ousted al-Bashir and Ibn Auf, and how long can we expect protests to continue? And this is to everybody on the panel. Yeah, feel free to jump in, raise a hand.
Okay, well, the reason that the protesters are still there in front of the Army headquarters is still the same reason why they started protesting in December. Mm-hmm. Or specifically, I would say after January 1st, when the Declaration of Freedom and Change came out. The Declaration of Freedom and Change mainly said that we need a civilian transitional government. Mm-hmm. And it hasn't happened yet. So whether it's a different army official, it doesn't matter. Our demands, the demands of the people protesting, have not been met, and that's why they're still out there protesting.
Thank you.
This question is to Mr. Kushkush and Ms. Steigent. This revolution, as with all revolutions, has proven to be increasingly difficult to keep up with, at least from America or Europe, where Western media outlets often reduce the many players to just civilians or military. So, Mr. Kushkush, you mentioned earlier that the Sudanese Professional Association has played a key role within organizing the protests. Are there any other factions within the quote-unquote opposing forces that we should know about?
So, as I mentioned, the Sudanese Professionals Association basically is an independent collective of independent trade unions. Trade unions in Sudan since 1989 have been under government control, government sanctioned. This was the SPA, the Sudanese Professionals Association, was an attempt to create a body that would be parallel to the government-sanctioned one, but also bring back the historical role that trade unions have played in Sudan. I'd mentioned that this is the third popular uprising in Sudan. October 1964, April 1985, trade unions played a key role in organizing the masses. Now, the main body that has been leading the protest is what is called the Freedom and Change Declaration Forces, which is an alliance of different groups that includes the Sudanese Professionals Association, the Sudan Call Alliance, al-Haraka al-Ittihadiyya, the Unionist Movement, which is a political party, and Quwa Ijma' Sudan, the Sudanese Consensus Forces. These are various alliances, and again, it's complicated. I know it's a lot to take at once, but it gives you an idea of the background that, the problems of modern Sudanese political, there are many actors and different alliances, but those are that is the main group. But I think more than anything else is to recognize the very important role that youth have played in this, and then women have played in this. Those are the organizations at the top level, but the machine that has been keeping this going on are youth at large and women specifically.
Thank you for that, Khalid. I want to briefly revert back to Marine's point as to what the protesters are currently protesting. Now, as Mr. Kushkush mentioned, on April 11th, Bashir was pushed out. The following day, Ibn Auf was also pushed out. And currently, Abdel Fattah Burhan is currently the seat of power in the country. Now, our question is, for lack of better wording, how deep is the deep state? And what will it take for the Sudanese public to accept the leadership that is proposed? If Khalid could provide some perspective on that.
How deep is the deep state? 30 years deep. It's just like everywhere else in the region. It's they came in. Al-Bashir and Turabi and the Islamic movement, they came in with something called a tamkeen, which what does it mean in Arabic? Tamkeen? In English, sorry.
Empowerment.
Empowerment. So they empowered their own people. Thousands and thousands of families, including my own, had to leave Sudan. Professionals, doctors, engineers, whatever. Most of them left because of the empowerment of their own party. So we, imagine in 30 years, imagine how deep that is. And of course, with the total, takeover of society and education, and they erased most of the Sudanese social structure by implementing their own, which is the Islamic civilization project, as they call it. So it's very deep, and it's not going to be easy. As we can see, because the two presidents that we have after Bashir were both lately just photographed sitting behind him. So that shows you that they're not, we're really not where we should be, and there hasn't been a real change.
Going back to the point Mr. Kushkush made about the youth and women being involved in the protest, I just wanted to ask Nasreen and Marine, in point to the picture of Ala Saleh that I'm sure you've all seen of her standing on a car and leading protesters wearing the white thobe and traditional Sudanese jewelry. And so the attention paid to women's active role in this revolution peaked when this photo went viral, but many are pointing to the fact that Sudanese women have always played a pivotal role in Sudan's struggles for liberation. So could both of you contextualize this history further?
Sure, yeah. I think, the picture has been sort of at the center of a little bit of debate online, and I think part of what bothered me in the way that the international media kind of, the image was used, I think it it captured the international media's attention and focused it briefly, however brief, we'll see, on Sudan. But, you know, what bothered me about actually the way that it was discussed was that we weren't actually listening to what women organizers were saying. And, you know, people were kind of captured by the image, I think, partly because it defied normative ideas of Muslim women speaking out bravely, you know, and sort of this idea of, you know, Muslim women needing a Western savior, et cetera. And I think, of course, those of us who know our history know that Sudanese women have always been involved in, had a leading role in the anti-colonial movement and popular uprisings in 1964, 1985. The Sudanese Women's Union has had a long history of fighting for equal pay, maternity leave, and the women's right to vote. And we have several iconic figures that were, you know, alluded to in the discussion of this image. I think the other thing to keep in mind, you know, so to us, I think it didn't come as a surprise that 70% of the protesters are women. And they've been not just participating, but also they're organizers and strategists, right? And you know, recently a statement came out by one of the women's groups that, you know, that basically said there needs to be about 50 or more percent representation in this civilian transitional government in all facets of it who are women. And in addition to that, there needs to be a kind of affirmative action policy that makes sure that women and representatives from marginalized areas are equally represented. So I think, yeah, again, I don't have a whole lot to say. I think there's a way that we recount Sudanese feminist and revolutionary history that focuses on icons that I think oftentimes excludes, if you will, working class women and kind of and also the role of, say, Hakkamat in areas like Darfur, who were women poets who played a historically significant role in peace building efforts. You also have, you know, an all women's battalion who fought with the SPLA during the civil war called Katabat Banat. And so, you know, this history is not that well documented. So that's partly what I'm interested in. Is we've been doing an oral history kind of project, talking to women from across Sudan to really try to start documenting that. And I think that can start now, is talking to different kinds of women about why they're involved. And of course, a lot of women have been feeling the brunt of this extractive war economy for a long time, right? The economy in Sudan did not collapse. It started collapsing in 2011 when the South seceded, right? It started way before that. And so, and women have, you know, borne the brunt of that as being sort of trying to figure out how to make ends meet and all of that.
And also, if I may jump in, Sudan's nickname is Azza, which is a woman's name, and nickname, which is, you know, sung by in a lot of poems and political songs and traditional songs, comes from the wife of one of the leaders of the 1924 rebellion against the British. His name is Ali Abdul Latif, and his wife's name was Azza. And she led the first protests after he was jailed. So there was a lot of poetry around the name Azza. And Azza actually means, you know, the secret groups working in secret used to call the code name for Sudan was Azza. So that shows you how, you know, that's a big story as well about, you know, the traditionally how empowered the women are.
And to juxtapose that image with, that image went viral in Western media. To compare it to another image that went viral amongst Sudanese protesters was an image of a female protester back in the days where protests were faced by tear gas, and she took a tear gas canister and threw it back at the security forces. That was the one that was more sensational to Sudanese protesters, because it wasn't just aesthetic. It showed that the women are really on the ground participating and you know, in a very physical sense. And also to compare it to another image of I think they're high school students, all female high school students. This image surfaced, I think, in early December, before the protest started in Damazin or Adbara. And this shows that even the early protests were fueled by women. It is unfortunate that the image that gained Western media attention, yes, it supports that yes, Sudanese women are have a big role in the Sudanese Revolution, but it completely disregards that this is an image of a working class woman or a middle class woman in the center. The white tobe is something that is worn by government staff in the center of Sudan. Other images that are, at least from my personal perspective, they are just as aesthetic of women in Darfur, in internally displaced people's camps, in colorful tobes. You can't wear a white tobe and keep it clean if you're working in the field. So these women were protesting in camps, but it didn't gain much attention. But I guess in an area where there's a war, a protest is not news.
Thank you so much. Marine, going off of that, because you were in Sudan over the past couple of months and protesting and on the ground with people, can you speak to the internal networks created by Sudanese women during the revolution? And in particular, I know there was, BuzzFeed reported on a Facebook group created by Sudanese women to alert each other about police in their neighborhoods or in their vicinities. So could you speak more to that?
I believe you're referring to Mumbarshat. So it's not just to alert each other. I mean, the history of this Facebook group is interesting because it started as sort of you post an image of your crush, and then other females, give you the dirt about him. And in times of revolution, the purpose of that group changed. You post an image of a potential security forces officer, and all the females who know him would tell you where he lives, his phone number, where he works. And it became very dangerous for security forces. And it actually changed the way they work on the ground. They had to cover their faces. And there are a lot of factors that are at play when it comes to this, because it's funny how these are the women who force these men to cover their faces, but instead, after they started covering their faces, they were faced by a lot of misogynistic jokes like, "Oh, we've turned you into women." So,
thank you, Marine. We'd now like to address sort of what you can consider to be the recovery phase, so Omar Bashir's fate. Different people have different opinions on how about this process should be carried through in Sudan. Some people believe that Bashir should be tried in the International Criminal Court, and some are advocating for a tribunal within the Sudanese court. What are the protests demanding, Mr. Kushkush, Ms. Steigent, Khalid, anyone who wants to chime in? What is the fate of Mr. Bashir?
Susan?
Ms. Steigent?
Sure. I don't know that I'm the best person to speak to this one in particular. I'll just share that I found it really interesting that people with whom I've spoken have talked about wanting a Sudanese-based judicial process. And I think if we look at that in the international context, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the International Criminal Court is engaged when a country is unable or unwilling to investigate and prosecute. And so given the change that's taking place, it seems that there's an opening to build the capacity, rebuild, give space for the capacity of the judiciary and the tremendous legal minds that are in Sudan and who are Sudanese, and to allow that process to happen within the country. I think ultimately this is something that Sudanese need to decide where to take it. The challenge then will be to see how to marshal the necessary support and backing, and I'm not just talking about financial or technical, but in many ways the more diplomatic from members of the international community.
Also, there's a video that surfaced today or yesterday Hamidti, which is the leader of the rapid forces, and now he's the second in command in the military council, saying that Bashir was asked to stay under house arrest, but then when he I think he resisted, and then they had to send him to jail. He said they had to send him to jail. So I don't think they're looking at trial or looking at anything like that anytime soon at all. So that just, again, shows you that we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Now, in relation to regional foreign influence, just a couple of days ago, Saudi Arabia...
It was never, discussed openly, issues of ethnicism and racism in Sudan, which even precede Bashir. I mean, these are deep social issues. But I think that was key, and it showed the qualitative difference between this uprising and what has happened in the past. And I think that was significant. Two of the major Darfuri rebel groups are members of the opposition coalition, the Freedom and Change Forces Alliance. One rebel group hasn't signed yet, but I think that Darfuris will definitely play a major role in, and not just Darfuris, but people from different marginalized areas of Sudan this time around will play a significant role in shaping the future of the country in whatever transition happens.
Inshallah.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think, and you can answer it sort of in two ways. I think in this immediate moment, I think the fact that you have both Burhan and Hamidti, who are still kind of running the show, who are war criminals, who hold a particular significance in terms of the atrocities that they've committed in Darfur. And the fact that, just today, the Darfur Bar Association, demanded that political detainees, hundreds of political detainees who still remain detained in Darfur, be released during this sit-in after al-Bashir was ousted. There were protests that were happening in places like Darfur, but also in the east, where people were shot at, where the military did not side or protect the protesters. So I think there's a need to keep that central at the moment, to say, hey, just like what's happening in Khartoum, because there's been a myopic focus in terms of the media has only been focusing on Khartoum, and there are all these, there's all this violence that continues to happen elsewhere. So that's, I think, one thing. I think the other question about Black liberation and sort of how do we connect, one of the things I've been thinking about is, I hear these media interviews. Journalists always ask us about, well, are people learning from Egypt? Is this why they're kind of staying on the streets? And the fact is, we've had a popular uprising in Burkina Faso 2014. We've had uprisings in Zimbabwe. We've had uprisings in the DRC that all led to, a change in government that were very similar in terms of, extractive war economy, the same demands that people were making. And we saw here, ZANU-PF take over again. We saw, in the Congo, again, somebody who's close to Kabila taking over. That's really, I think, where they're more recent, and we can learn from that, right? So I think there's a way that, to me, what's exciting about this moment is really thinking about, how can we move beyond the national borders within Africa to really connect to the movements that exist in other African countries, because we're all pretty much demanding very similar things, right? And so how can that then also connect to other Black communities outside of the continent in terms of the solidarity work that we have ahead of us to do. So,
I think regarding that, it's I think it's this is what should happen. But as being Sudanese, our culture is if you ask any Sudanese about what happened in Congo, they probably wouldn't even know what the capital of Congo is, but they would know what happened yesterday in Cairo. So it's whether we like it or not, this is closer, and this is what we're culturally accustomed to. I think because of what happened in the last 30 years, actually what happens in the independence of Sudan, of how Arabites everything was, it's going to be very hard to turn it. But I don't think it's hard. I think it's hard now. But I think once we have the doors open, the education open, means of communication open with the rest of Africa, I think it's going to be a lot better to connect, because now people want that. Now people understand, the importance of us to Africa and Africa to us. So I think it's better. But now I think most focus is in the Arab world. Most people in Sudan know more about the Arab world than in Africa. So it's it's a lot of people get upset about it, and when people talk about the Arab Spring, but it's sadly that I think I don't know if it's sadly, but I think it's part of it. I really believe that.
Can I just quickly? Sudan is a country with multiple roots, and I think it influences and is influenced by different groups. Whether it, I'm not a big fan of a hard line of what is Arab and what is African. And but we've seen videos of Cameroonian protesters in Khartoum chanting, "If this can happen in Sudan, it can happen in Cameroon." I've on my own social media, Kenyan, Zimbabwean, Algerian activists have been retweeting, and even Venezuelan activists have been, seeing what's happening in Sudan and being inspired by that. So I think, and even in Syria, in Idlib, we've seen a mural of Ala Salah. So, what is happening, and because of social media, that, different groups of people are being inspired by this, and hope to pursue the same.
Now, jumping off Khalid's point on what now or what next, Ismail mentioned earlier in our discussion what was considered the F word in African governments in the 60s and 70s, federal. This question is posed to Susan. Given that Federacy actually worked within Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country that's currently constituted based off ethnic origins, so it's a federation. Do you think a federation has any role or any potential success within Sudan?
Well, I think I'd first ask a question about whether people think that it worked in Ethiopia. I think ethnic federalism worked in Ethiopia during a period of a one-party state, where there were certain agreements about how things were done, and where one party had the monopoly of power and the use of force. And I think Ethiopia will be contemplating some of these same questions for themselves going forward about how should they organize themselves and how should they govern themselves. And you can see just next door that those tensions are starting to pull apart in terms of the cohesion of the country in Ethiopia. So in terms of Sudan, I was going to say that actually one of the medium-term opportunities to keep the We Are All Darfur at the front is potentially around a conversation on Sudan's constitution. And it's about identity, it's about what are people's priorities, it's about people seeing themselves in the fundamental constitutional law in a way that actually protects them. I think, federalism is like many broad concepts. It means absolutely everything and absolutely nothing all at once. And so the question will be, how do you organize government so that people can have services delivered, so that they can get their kids to school, that they can have access to clean water, that there can be roads and transport that works, so that markets can flourish, and that you could underpin sort of a broader identity. So federalism is one way to do that, but there are lots of different ways. So for me, it's always about how do you unpack it and walk it backwards, rather than choosing a model, choosing what are the characteristics, and then you can call it whatever you want to call it.
Thank you for that, Susan. So going back to the logistics of the revolution, just our final couple of questions before we open up the floor to Q&A. This question is for Ismail and Khalid. In the early stages of the revolution, local newspapers were censored and forcibly shut down by the government in the fear of their reporting on the protests. How have local Sudanese media outlets played a role in the revolution, and how has this role evolved throughout the course of the past 4 months?
So, I mean, Sudan for the last 30 years, press freedoms has been suppressed in Sudan, and coverage or attempts to cover the protest, newspapers were censored. Keep in mind, newspapers and radio still are really the main sources of information in Sudan, along with social media. But official media, newspapers and radio, and also now with satellite TV. Two main newspapers that had tried to cover the protest in a professional way, Tayar and Al Jarida, were repetitively censored. Even Tayar at one point started publishing all black pages, showing that it attempted to cover the protest, but was not allowed to. So I think that's for local media. For international media, I mean, Khartoum is not a hub it's not like Cairo or Nairobi where you have international journalists that are permanently based. If you're trying to cover Sudan, you need a visa to enter, and what the government was doing at the time was basically either ignoring requests for visas or straightforward rejecting it. So in the very first month, you were not seeing a good deal of coverage from international media outlets. That has changed in the past 10 days. I think there are a number of journalists that are in Khartoum now.
Mm-hmm. And I think also in the early stages of the revolution, many Sudanese people expressed frustration with the fact that Sudanese channels on TV, like Sudan TV and Sudania 24 and Blue Nile TV, weren't showing anything on the revolution on the news. And so then WhatsApp became a form of reporting and became like a sort of local way of collecting information and distributing it. I feel like I'm part of like 50 WhatsApp groups about the revolution. So can you all speak to some of the networks beyond the one that was created by women that exist for spreading information and making sure that protesters are all on the same page?
What WhatsApp is because of the lack of freedom of speech, and the lack of free media in Sudan for years. Since the introduction of social media to Sudan, WhatsApp became this sort of where academics and journalists write long essays and start forwarding them around, and it's all these articles that you get from your mom and your aunt and stuff. But then later the government caught on to it, and then that became a war. So I think most of the war that's happening right now is actually on WhatsApp, because there's no real source of information. Nobody knows what's real because there's no information. Nobody knows what's happening. So the government just pours a lot of material on there, whatever they want to do, they just circulate it. And the same thing with the opposition or with the activists or whatever. So now I think in 2019, and a big part of that is how I think people, and even my mother's generation, has started to realize there's fake news and that, no, this doesn't make sense and this makes sense. But in 2011, 2013, it was a mess. Nobody knew what was going on. That's why, and this is how the government controlled the media, I think, for the longest time as well. So now I think because most of these protesters who are on the road right now or on the street right now, they only saw Bashir as president. They're all under 30 years old, mostly, So they they understand media. They know how to deal with media. They understand social media. The first thing that the government did was cut off access to social media the first days of the protests. Half an hour later, everybody's on back on social media, including my mom. And what's his name? Martez Musa, the prime minister at the time, or whatever his position was. And he was tweeting, and everybody was tweeting back, like, how are you tweeting? I thought, you guys cut off the internet. So it's really, internet is a whole, like, WhatsApp is a whole other story, and it's still happening right now. And I think until we free the media, until we have free media, we have TV, especially, and newspapers, because this is how, the news gets to the marginalized areas. We're not going to have the upper hand in this revolution at all.
Khaled, given that news sources have become unreliable or are censored, can you speak to the emerging art scene and how art has become a form of news telling?
I think art, as in every revolution around the world, art since the French Revolution or since the pharaohs, really, it's a way to tell what's happening. So I was in Sudan in November and in December when everything started, When I saw graffiti, and not nice, pretty graffiti, no, graffiti talking about الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام تسقط بس on the road, on Khartoum. This is the most dangerous thing that anybody could do. And that was there, and it was on big signs, right? This is when I knew that the fear was broken. That's it. This is something that's totally different happening right now. Because, you know, around 2013 and 2011, you see it. You see the graffiti, but it's made in fear. Like people just write it and run, right? But now, no, people are climbing on to like big ads, and they're just tagging it. And then, of course, you have, you know, one of the most amazing, I think, activists and artists now in Sudan. Her name is Asil Diab, and she does graffiti. And she did a portrait of each murder, of each shuhada, people that passed away in the revolution. She did a portrait of them in their house, in their neighborhood, as a reminder of them. And that is so courageous because, you know, first of all, she's a girl. Second of all, she's walking around with all this material, and it takes time to draw these things. Sometimes she was protected by the people in the neighborhood, right? And I think that made such an effect on the revolution that people are going out there, young people are going out there and doing, you know, and writing and risking their lives actually trying to write these tags. So I think art was a huge part of it, and then of course the graphic designers were just doing posters and posters and posters and materials as well for, you know, just for social media and stuff like that, just infographics about what happened, about corruption. So a lot of people were doing a lot of things, and of course the music, you know. Now today, Ayman Mao, who's a Sudanese reggae artist, who's been for the last 10 years just recording songs, recording in his car in America, right, and just, you know, sending them online, now has more than 3 million people singing along with him in the HQ, in the Al-Qiyada, right now, as we speak, while Bashir is in jail. An artist is singing in the army central Qiyada, and Bashir is in jail. How amazing is that? You know, so it's I think art has been a huge part of this revolution, and every revolution, of course. But in Sudan, it's beautiful to see that, because one of the main things that this government did in the last 30 years, that it killed beauty, it killed art, it killed cinema, and it killed the way that people understand it and people appreciate it. Even our own traditional art was just, you know, neglected. You know, so to see it come back in a way that they were not supported whatsoever. You know, these young talented kids from cartoonists to graphic designers to illustrators to musicians is incredible, and it shows you that this is part of it, you know. And they channeled their anger, and they succeeded at doing that.
And that's a really poignant point to make, especially when thinking about the fact that when Bashir's regime came to power, so many artists left Sudan in fear of what the regime meant for them and for their art and for their people. So it's just such like a very poignant comeback. And you saying it in such a way like really stirred that up for me. So thank you for that reminder. In our very homes, like, racism seeps into every single conversation we have about people that aren't from the north or aren't from Central Sudan. So it's like, how deeply can we get to the core of the toxicity of racism that exists in Sudan is really, like, I think, where I see where your question is coming from. So thank you for that. Yeah, if no more comments, then... Oh, yeah, right in the middle, we have a question, if you want to come up. Oh, you can come up into the mic, because I won't be able to hear you. Or you can go up there, yeah. Yeah, just say your name.
Hi, Abu Bakr. Just had a question, basically, of relating to moving forward as well. A big point actually has been a lot of people have benefited from this regime. For 30 years, people have made money. Businesses, political figures, tribes have enjoyed a lot of privilege. And one of the things that has been apparent has also been that they haven't taken an active part in these protests. They've actually sometimes worked actively to sabotage them. So I'm wondering, is there going to be somewhat, to move forward, this is a large part of the population that you're going to have to include in this progress somehow. And forgiveness is hard. You can't just say all is forgiven and forgotten, but is there a possibility for something like the Truth and Reconciliation mission that happened in South Africa, where people can really come forward and talk about what's been done and how to progress? Or is it going to be this sort of continuous struggle of you were part of the regime. And you're already seeing that actually in social media where people are being sort of called out for what they did and how they helped the regime. And so I'm kind of confused because you need this high of inclusivity is great, but it's still exclusive to people who sort of actively took part in the protests. And you need these people to sort of move forward and forget and sort of change the context. So what do you guys think could happen in that regard? Thank you.
I mean, I think these are the conversations that the political actors are going to have. I mean, none of us here are on the ground or in a place of power to make these things happen. But these are the kind of discussions that we're seeing. I mean, the fact that you're even bringing this up, these are also happening in Khartoum. These are topics that Sudanese have never publicly discussed in a way to address these issues. So, I mean, I think it starts with paying attention to how will justice be achieved, what kind of what formula will that take. I think that all of that. I mean, things are changing very quickly. I mean, we're all just following our WhatsApp groups and and seeing what's happening. But I think that is an important issue. I mean, how justice will be achieved and what kind of path will reconciliation take.
My comment is not really an answer. It's more like, yes, I've been having the same thoughts. Going back to the document about the bodies of governance that the SPA just published, they mentioned that the Transitional Council, any member in it has to be, and it was very harsh language, the way they phrased it is that any individual in that council has to have had absolutely no relations whatsoever with the Inqaz regime for its entire known history. And I'm just thinking, I'm like, are we just gonna import a lot of people? Because there's no way that you're somebody who is qualified and had experience enough that would qualify you to be part of that transitional council, and you have not been involved with the government in one way or another. So personally, I think we have to be somewhat realistic and prioritize what should be addressed and what should be forgiven in a way, because if you compare, let's say, figures who have been involved financially with the government with some allegations of corruption that are probably definitely true, and war criminals. We can't just eliminate everybody who has been part of the government, but we can prioritize what must be addressed and what we can let go.
Hi, so my name is Mazen. My question for you guys is kind of about compromise. So I know with the appointment of Hameti as the second in command, a lot of Darfurians were ostracized because of what happened and his role in the Darfur genocide. So I guess my question is, for the marginalized group or marginalized groups, what do you guys think they would be willing to compromise on? Like, for example, I know Nubian folks still hold a grudge because of the Aswan High Dam and the High Dam. So for us, we're like, absolutely no way. For Darfurians, they're like, do we really want to acknowledge somebody who has killed people? So my question in that, because I guess it's a two-part question, is what does the role of Khartoum as a center, as a metropolis, have as compared to the peripheries? And then what is asking too much of people to give up?
I think this is partly a difficult question because none of us are from marginalized regions of Sudan. So, and I think, I'm just going to sort of answer it by saying that, I've been in conversation with a group of people who are inside the sit-in who recently organized this amazing gallery where they put up images of some of the atrocities that have, been committed across the country. Not only, and they're mostly the people who organized it were mostly from Darfur, but they were also highlighting atrocities in other places, like in eastern Sudan, like in the northern, where you're from, right? In terms of people being displaced because of government-built dams, and I think and then they paired that with like political education and lectures, etc. So all that to say that I think there are many people inside the sit-in in these marginalized areas who can elaborate and sort of give an answer to that. I'm not one of those people, but I think part of our role, and this is sort of going back to what we spoke about earlier, is that when the media focuses on Sudan, it's been mostly focused on Khartoum, and it's been mostly focused on the same people who have been spokespeople in the media.